I've learned something about Scott too. He's an anticipatory stander. So as soon as I said that he was going to lead prayer, he started to stand up, and then he goes to sit back down, and he's waiting for the moment when he can get up. And that gave me a lot of power. So just so you know, you have a tell. Okay, so tonight yes, sir.
This is kind of selfish of me, but would you let people know that Brian's in the hospital? He's going to be there a long time. That's my grandson, and we really want the prayers of everybody that gets the virus.
It is not selfish of you at all. So for those who have not heard, I'm sorry, I thought that had gone out to everybody already, but I will make sure and repeat it here, Reggie. So Brian, Reggie and Janice's grandson, is in the hospital with COVID and is in a bad strait at the moment, and we definitely want to keep him in our prayers. He's got a young family, and anything you'd add to that, Reggie? Anything you'd add to that?
No, except that apparently a lot of people don't read bullets, and that's bad because it was in the bulletin this past week.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. But yes, definitely want to keep Brian in our prayers, his whole family. Tonight, as we have been looking at evidences, we pivot a little bit from the purely scientific discussion to looking at what is often referred to as the moral law. So there's more than one way to talk to people about God's existence. And one of them is something that Romans 2 brings up, which is often kind of thought of as more of a philosophical argument, but is just as strong, which is in Romans 2 verse 14, it says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these not having the law are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them." The point in Romans chapter 2 is, so there were two groups of people that Romans dealt with in the first three chapters that are sinful. One were the Jews. And the Jews were sinful, and they knew it because they had the law. So they could go to the Old Testament law, particularly could look at something like the Ten Commandments and say, well, here's all the Ten Commandments, and look, I broke them. So I'm a sinner. And so they're condemned. But then you have the Gentiles, which are all the other nations. That's all the word Gentiles means, by the way, is just nations. So you had the Jews and then the nations. And so they didn't have the Old Testament law. But they did have a law that was written on their heart, their conscience bearing witness or else accusing or defending them. And it kind of goes like this. In every culture and every age, human beings have known that there are certain things that are just right and certain things that are just wrong. When they raise money to take care of starving children in a third world country, nowhere in the advertising do they have to explain to us that it is bad for children to starve. Because nobody's making that argument, right? Have you ever heard somebody go, really, actually, why is it so wrong for children to starve? Like, they wouldn't last a minute in the public square. In any culture, it is understood that these things are just simply wrong. You don't live in a culture where cowardice is aggrandized and people say, boy, aren't cowards the best, and those brave people are moral reprobates. Well, you can't even imagine a culture where such a thing existed. Because in every culture and every age, people have a general understanding of some universal moral truths that just simply are. And that's what Romans 2 is dealing with is, look, if you go out to the Gentile world, they know the same things that the Jews do in a real basic sense. They know that when you get married, you made a commitment, and if another man has a wife, you should stay away from her. And they know that if somebody buys stuff, that stuff belongs to them, and you shouldn't just take it. And that's just kind of understood. And nobody has to argue about whether or not stealing is okay or not. Now, we argue about what is stealing, or we argue about what the punishment should be for stealing, but we don't argue about whether or not stealing is wrong. It's just a generally understood truth. And James chapter 4, verse 12 says, there is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who's able to save and to destroy, but who are you who judge your neighbor? There's an interesting problem that we run into as human beings is, everybody wants to say, don't judge me. We like that saying. In fact, it may be the only part of the Bible that everybody knows. Don't judge me. But everybody judges Hitler. Anybody here want to raise their hand and say, you know, I haven't made a verdict on whether Hitler's a good guy or not? We're kind of universally understood that's bad, right? And we're okay with making that judgment. In fact, if you had somebody who didn't judge Hitler to be a bad guy, what would you think of them? You would think he's a bad guy, right? If I told you, I can see some good points about Hitler. If I started to talk like that, you would make some judgments about me. The reason for that is because there is a universal moral truth that we as human beings recognize. But here's the problem. If it's a universal moral truth, it has to come from a universal lawgiver, doesn't it? Do you see the problem? If we evolved just our accidents, is there any sort of universal moral truth? You can't stand on anything. It just becomes a matter of preference. So the way that you might look at it is you would say, here's the train of logic. Every law has a lawgiver. There is a universal moral law. And by the way, there only has to be one. We only have to agree on one thing as human beings that is a universal moral law for it to be true. We don't have to agree on everything. Just that if there's even one thing that is 100% true all the time, then you are stuck with therefore there is a moral lawgiver. And that moral lawgiver can't be us. It's impossible for it to be us, because if it was us, if I'm the lawgiver and I say, I've decided that this is the moral law for everybody, what are you going to say to me? If I stand up and I say, I've got a moral law that everybody has to obey. Yeah, some of you back there said, who are you? That's right. Who are you to say that? I don't have a right to impose that on you. Who are you to judge me? Right? I can't impose my own personal judgment on any other human being. So if we say that there is a universal moral law, it can't come from a human being. It has to come from a greater source than humans, and that's God. He's the universal moral lawgiver. The problem that we run into is if there is no God, words like should, must, and ought don't work. And so these become your trigger words when you're having a conversation with somebody. Should, must, and ought. Let me give you an example from about 10 minutes ago. I got out of my vehicle and my phone dinged, and there was a notification on the Eastland Facebook page that we've been advertising for the Chuck Durham meeting. And some guy that I don't know had posted publicly and said, because Chuck's going to be talking about connecting the next generation to Christ, and he says, well, the next generation is done with your Bronze Age beliefs, and the next generation will be happy when your bigoted, speaking of Christianity, bigoted beliefs fade away. So I look at that. I'm going to have to go teach Bible class. How do I answer that? Well, I just answered it with a question because I want a little bit more information. And I don't want to get into a big Facebook fight with a guy because just because he said something offensive doesn't mean I need to say something offensive. But my question was simply this: what is it about Jesus that you think is bigoted? And my follow-up question is, if he is telling me something that's wrong about Jesus, I'm going to say, how do you decide what's right and wrong? Because if there is no Jesus, there is no God, if everything just evolved, what's wrong with being a bigot? What's the problem? There isn't a problem with it. My wife grew up on a farm and they had too many cats. But they're all these outdoor mousing cats. And she found out a long time ago that when cats are born, you have this big litter of cats. The cats that looked alike would hang out with each other, and the cats that didn't look alike on the farm would sometimes be left to starve. Cats do that all the time. Now, if human beings did that, human beings said, I'll hang out with people who look like me, and I won't hang out with people who don't look like me, and in fact, I'll let them die. Would we be okay with that? Please say no. Okay? Can we agree that that would be wrong if human beings did what cats did? But you don't think it's wrong when a cat does it. You think it maybe is sad or something like that because you think like a human, you don't think like a cat. But cats don't think in terms of moral things. They're not following a moral law. You are, because God put a conscience in you. And so this idea of you should do this, you must do that. If I turn to Steve and I say, you must do this, I'm appealing to some greater moral authority as to why he must do it. Or ought. So these words are triggers for us to know as we're talking with somebody, if somebody says you should, you must, you ought, and they don't believe in God, I'm going to ask them, why should I, why must I, and why ought I? Because there's no reason I should, must, or ought if there is no God. That make sense? Anybody have a question or anything they'd add to that? A little bit? Just yeah. I agree. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson, Declaration of Independence, says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When you say that something is self-evident, what do you mean by that? What does it mean when they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident? Somebody explain that for me. It's obvious. I don't have to prove it. Right? It is true, and nobody's going to argue with it. That is when we make the statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I'm going to argue the other side for a second. No, they aren't. No, they aren't. People are born into different classes all the time. Some people are born into rich families, some people are born into poor families. Some people are born into rich countries, some people are born into poor countries. Some people are born, have perfect health, 10 fingers, 10 toes. Other people struggle with health problems from day one. They are not equal. Why do we consider it self-evident? If there's anything you see the opposite, that everybody is different. So why are we saying that it's self-evident that all men are created equal? Okay, so everybody has the potential to what? They do have the potential to succeed, but now I'm being ornery. This is my job right now. This is the best part of my job, by the way. You take somebody in a third world country, they don't have the benefits that I had growing up. They can work as hard as they want. They're not going to succeed like I succeed. So I would argue we're not even equal in our potential for success. Yeah. Okay. We're equal in terms of value as a human soul, right? Now, I do understand what you're saying, too, that there is potential and people can meet their potential and things like that. But I think this is more what the Founding Fathers were likely getting at, is that everybody has equal value.
Well, I know we like to argue Thomas a lot with what they're talking about, but he's saying that we all have the same rights under the law because God created us.
Right. And so here's the thing.
This is semi-colon, by the way. I know it's not.
I love how that was important for you to stop and correct that you said comma, but you meant something. Like, that tells me so much about your personality. Like, I will miss you, John. I will miss you desperately. So, now, I understand this is not a Bible verse, but we're talking about the way people talk about rights. Yeah.
The ironic thing about that statement is who it was written by, who owned slaves.
Oh, yeah.
And at the time, slaves were not equal.
Right.
So to me, not living by it.
Yeah, and don't we all do that, right? Don't we all? I say everybody has equal value. I can talk about that intellectually and academically all day long, but I don't treat everybody the way I ought to. So you're absolutely right. And yet we look at something like that, and their point was, we don't need to prove this to be true. It just is. It just is. It's a self-evident, obvious truth that every human being has equal value. Now, here's my whole point of this. That's not a Bible verse. That's just people talking. But that's the sound of people appealing to a universal moral law. That's what that is. It's an example of it. We're Americans living in an American culture, so I wouldn't know what sort of example I'd use in another culture. But here, we're familiar with the Declaration of Independence. And they said we have a right to rebel against the king because everybody should be treated equally. And that's not happening right now. And so it is that idea of self-evident things is an appeal to the idea that there are certain truths about how we should treat people, truths about right and wrong. Because right and wrong is not a matter of science. Right? Science can tell you what you can do. It won't tell you whether you should do it. And there's lots of scientists who have, and it makes me nauseous even saying it, perfected abortion and the procedures. They've gotten better at it. Science can tell you how to do that, but it doesn't answer the question of whether or not you should. And yet we talk about right and wrong all the time. In fact, what are the two major areas that you are told as a human being? Don't talk about these two things if you want to keep your friends. Don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion, right? And guess what both politics and religion are about? Right and wrong questions. Ethics. The issue that we run into as human beings is we want to talk about right and wrong, but then we want to remove the idea of a creator. But if there is no creator, then the only one truth is survival of the fittest. Which means whatever keeps me going is okay. If I have to stomp on your face to get ahead, so be it. Survival of the fittest. If I need to do something that will forward the progress of what I want and it hurts other people, go right ahead and do it. So it's a very strong non-scientific argument. We're going to look at 6 different things that are proof of the moral law if you're talking with people. The first one is that it's simply undeniable, and that's what I mean by must, should, and ought. Imagine taking those words out of the English language. You can never say should, you can never say ought, and you can never say must. How long would it take for you to start grabbing for one of those words? Just a couple of minutes. Can you imagine raising your kids without the words should, must, and ought? You might as well just lay down and die. I mean, you need those words. They're directional, aren't they? You find yourself stumbling over it in the same way that when we move over to the scientific realm, they find themselves stumbling into words like design. Because when you start looking at organisms, you see, wow, look at this really impressive design. Look at how they are well adapted for their environment. And you start using words like design, and you are stuck with the problem of, well, if there's design, there's a designer. You start using words like should, must, and ought, and you're stuck with there is a moral lawgiver. So the idea of it being undeniable is, imagine a world where it didn't exist. I think he put in the book, he said, imagine a world where bravery was condemned and where cowardice was applauded. Imagine a world where where letting children starve to death was praised and taking care of the needy was laughed at. You can't imagine a world like that existing. So it's really hard to just simply deny the moral law, because it's really hard to imagine living in a world where we didn't care about it. Where murder was something that was considered a good thing. Even we as Christians talk about abortion as murder. Why don't they just call it pro-murder? Right? We're pro-life. Why not call it pro-murder? Why is it pro-choice instead of pro-murder? Murder is something that everybody agrees is wrong. Right? So we change the term to pro-choice. Why? Because that doesn't sound as bad. And who here is against choice? Choice seems like a good thing, right? Yeah, Reggie?
I'm sorry I'm not picking up everything, but I'm getting close to it, I hope, and I hope I'm not repeating something. But in a debate between an atheist or a gospel preacher, the preacher asked him, if there's no God and no moral law that governs man, what's wrong with just killing you? You're right here now.
Mm-hmm.
He sat there, the professor sat there, and he said, it will be unpleasant for me for you to do that. And my first thought was, it wouldn't be unpleasant very long, depending on what kind of weapon you use to kill him with.
Yeah, you don't have a moral high ground to say you can't do that, right? It is the really sticky wicket if you take the evolutionary pathway to have that moral high ground. Yeah.
When you get these societies, when there is no appeal to greater authorities, you get societies like Adolf Hitler's Germany, and you get the Spartans who, history glosses over them, but they did some pretty powerful things.
Very.
But they were at the right place at the right time as far as the history books go. So they're not considered horrible, incestuous, pedophilia, whatever, would bring them up. When there is no moral law, then anything is acceptable. So any rationality you can come up with for the collective becomes the law. And then you get situations like China where they put people in concentration camps today, and they have organ harvesting today, because they decided their society is benefited by taking from the weak and the oppressed and giving to the members of their party.
Right. Yeah. And you're right. The further a society tries to remove God, a natural consequence of that is that further and further you get away from having any leg to stand on for saying there are certain universal rights and wrongs. Anybody else have something? Okay, so the second one then is our reactions help us discover the moral law. One easy way to have this kind of a conversation with somebody is find something that they consider morally repugnant. And everybody's got something. Maybe it's the way women are treated. Maybe it's starvation of children in a third world country. Maybe it's the way people cut in line. I mean, it can be really something simple. It's like, man, I can't believe that guy was at Disney and he cut right in line. I've been waiting an hour and a half for Splash Mountain. Anytime somebody has ire over something and they go, I can't believe that guy did that, or that's so wrong, you have entered into the realm of talking about morality. Our reactions, and everybody has a reaction to something. Like I said with the guy on Facebook, he doesn't like Christianity. I don't know why yet. I haven't talked to him long enough. Stay tuned. All right? But he has a moral problem with Christianity. At some level, whatever his experience is, he believes Christianity to be bigoted. Okay? Let's dive into that a little bit, because at the end of the day, at some point, you're going to have to get to the question of there is right and wrong. Okay, where did that come from? And how do we decide it? And who has the right to say what is right and wrong? And So when somebody has a very visceral reaction to things, even if that visceral reaction is to Christianity, there's been a lot of reactions that I've gotten over the years from people where they essentially will say, well, Christianity has had lots and lots of people killed, it's destroyed so many lives, and a lot of times they're referring to things like the Crusades, right? Well, what they're saying is, I don't like any religion that goes out and hacks people's heads off because they don't believe what they believe. Guess what I like about that statement? I feel the same way, right? Don't you also find it morally repugnant, religions that do that? People who've done it in the name of Christianity, that doesn't mean that's what the Bible says. People have done things in the name of a lot of different things. That doesn't mean that's what God told them to do. So the reaction of people gives us an opportunity to have a conversation. Because it dials into okay, we agree there's something right and wrong. Now let's talk about that and where that comes from. Anybody have anything they'd add to that, or examples, or anything they can think of? Yeah.
I'm always trying to go in the Bible and finding small examples of something like this.
Mm-hmm.
In Acts chapter 23, you got Paul that's brought to the council, and the way I read this is it's been done here in the middle of the night, and everybody's come real quick.
Yep.
And he says, looking intently at the council, Paul says, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? And those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So typically the high priest is dressed in a certain robe where people would recognize that that's the high priest.
Right.
But because it was called, this mob was called together so quickly, Paul didn't even recognize that it's him. But there was a moral law that people saw that it was wrong for him to call out a high priest, and they reacted to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's, I realize you're getting into some laws that are written in God's law, but the Jewish people knew that was something you couldn't do.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
don't know if that's an example or not.
Well, and what you're dealing with is that even when people are doing something morally wrong, such as the kangaroo court they put Paul through there, right? That was wrong. It was even wrong according to their own law. Even when people are doing some things that are wrong, they're not throwing out and saying, you can do whatever you want. Nobody actually believes you can just do whatever you want. And it's interesting, some of the pickle that even Darwinists run into today, where you have guys like Dawkins, and he tries to argue that we should do the right thing for the sake of humanity as a whole. But the problem with that argument is if we just evolve from goo, why should I do anything for humanity as a whole? There's no good reason for it, right? It's only if we come from a common creator who's given us those rules. So, yeah. Yes. So you just got a whole world of confusion if it's just random accident that led to us being here. Yeah, absolutely. Third thing, without the moral law, there are no human rights. We universally as human beings believe in human rights, right? You go back to we consider these truths to be self-evident. We believe that humans have rights just simply by being a human. Is that true of any other creature on this planet, though? No. Dogs don't think other dogs have rights just because they're dogs. What do you think wolves do to the weak one in the pack? Yeah, you're out. You're done. Right? This happens all sorts. Raise chickens a little bit and you'll see how vicious things can get. Right? Only human beings say that all other human beings have a right to be. And if you don't have a moral law, you can't say that. And we know that's true because other creatures, which if Darwin is right, that's all we are, is just creatures. They don't follow that law. Sharks kill other sharks all the time. No problem. Chickens kill other chickens, eat other chickens all the time. No problem. Had a buddy, he had chickens, and they killed one chicken just because it looked different than the other chickens. And people just go, yeah, that's chickens. They just do that. Don't even get me started on goats. They're horrible. I think I'm joking. I had to work with goats for a while. They are really horrible. Their eyes don't even go the right direction. Human beings say the opposite, though, right? We say your very existence as a human means you have a right to be. Fifth one, a moral law is required to have any sort of standards, right? If we're going to say this is true for everybody all the time, that's a standard. Oh, I skipped forward, didn't I? Without the moral law, we can't know justice. That's tied to human rights. You have the same idea, right? Justice is that which is right and that which is wrong. Moral law is required if you want to have any sort of standards. You want to say this is the way it should be at all times, and then you have to have some sort of moral law. A simple example of that is in the family unit, right? When parents set boundaries for their kids and they say this is the standard in this family, why do mom and dad have the right to do that in the family? Say this is the standard for that family. Yeah, that's how God said it. It's an authority structure that God has put in place, and so all standards come around to that basic idea. And the last one is moral law can be seen in our excuses. If you've ever made an excuse for doing the wrong thing, so you're speeding along the highway. Police officer pulls you over. You know you were going the wrong speed. What do you start to tell him?
Going to church.
I was going to church. That's right. I was going to church. Going to church, officer. That's why I did that. You give some reason for it, right? When we do the wrong thing, we make an excuse for why it was right in that circumstance. What we don't ever do is simply say it wasn't wrong. I remember keenly, I have a cousin who's very close in age to me, and she was very annoying. I was the oldest of all the cousins, and she was very, very annoying. And she would say the exact same thing about me. And I remember one day I hit her. I was a little kid, and just like I hauled off and just hit Jackie in the face. And so all the parents come in and they're asking us, did you punch her? And of course she's crying and really good at crying. And so I can't deny it. I mean, it's very clear. Yes, I punched her. And they said, well, why'd you do that? I said, well, she ran into my fist. That was my excuse. She ran into my fist. In other words, yes, I did it. But really, it was her momentum that made it happen. We give an excuse for doing the wrong thing. I was not going to deny that hitting somebody was wrong. I was just going to say it doesn't apply to me in this circumstance. Those excuses, ironically, prove that we all are agreeing the implied idea that there's right and wrong. When I give an excuse for doing something that I know I shouldn't do, I am by implication saying there are things I shouldn't do. And you cannot avoid that as human beings. You can't avoid the moral law. You will run into it all the time. And so as people, that is there's a lot of different ways that we can get to that point of having a discussion with somebody that just leads back to that. Did you have something?
This popped up on my phone like a news flash or whatever. And it said scholars believe that we should accept pedophiles' choice of sexual activity. What?
And agreed, right? As a culture moves away from God, there's less and less adherence to the moral law, right? There's more degradation, but ultimately, you never get away from us talking about right and wrong. So this is disgusting, but I'm going to talk about the pedophile issue for a second. They're saying they should be allowed to do it because it's their preference. Well, why should I be allowed to do what's my preference? Isn't that a moral statement? Do you see the problem? We're still making moral statements. I think they're wrong in that case, but they think I'm wrong in saying that pedophilia is sinful. The fact that we're having that debate is disgusting, right? But it's still a conversation about right and wrong. So, yeah, go for it.
That's what Romans 1 describes. When they replace the truth of God with a lie.
Mm-hmm.
And then how society degrades from there.
Absolutely.
They end up turning to homosexuality, they end up turning disobedient to parents, all sorts of different things go on in society when that's lost. But I think the point is, even when all that's lost, people who are very degraded will still claim that they've got some story for how it's justice. They'll still claim that they've got some kind of standards that we're violating, and we're sitting against them for violating their standards, their standards. So even when they totally embrace the lie, they're saying, you're denying my human rights, you're not being just to me, you don't meet my standards, you don't agree with my definition of love.
Yep.
And so, while they're denying God, they're making these appeals that actually only have a basis in God, even though they don't recognize it.
Exactly. Yeah, and you're 100% right. That is the Romans 1 spiral, right? Is just further and further away from God, and everything gets totally flipped upside down. Right becomes wrong, wrong becomes right. But we're still talking about right and wrong. I mean, that's the irony of it, right? So, yes, I 100% agree, and I think that is, hopefully everybody was able to hear that some, just that even as a society degrades, it still has conversations about justice, it still has conversations about human rights, it still has conversations about standards, because we are an ethical being. I mean, that's nobody says, who cares about ethics? Let's just do it. That doesn't survive. No society ever goes that way.
I think what happens a lot of times is government law, people want to defend that.
Mm-hmm.
And in the place of moral law, the government says I can do it. But even if you look at government laws that are created, if there wasn't moral law out there somewhere, why would anybody oppose government-made laws?
Mm-hmm.
There are always two sides to every story.
Yeah.
So I think just being aware that will be the rationale for a lot of people just trying to say, well, an authority figure, not God, but
Right.
another authority figure, earthly authority figure has said, this is the law, this is what's right and wrong, they have defined it, so that's why we do it. That still doesn't mean this law is consistent.
Right. Yeah, and you're right. It does get muddy, right? So we want to stick to the generic of, okay, but we do agree there is such a thing as right and wrong. In which case, where's that conversation lead to? Yeah.
I just wonder if those scholars, whoever they were, if someone did that to their children, would they still think pedophile had the right to?
Oh yeah, and I mean, all of those sorts of things, obviously, people think in terms of broader things, and then oftentimes feel differently when it's their own personal life. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions on the moral law issue? Yes.
I'm not trying to start a debate, but do you believe there are certain innate qualities in man that he is born to border on the moral principles that God expects of people?
Yes. Yeah. That human beings, when they're born, have innate moral. Yes.
C.S. Lewis said, in the most primitive society, if you take a club and go over and smash your neighbor's skull and bring his goods back into your thing, that's wrong, no matter how primitive the society may be. And so I think there are certain innate qualities that we have born with that tell us don't do this, and I think that's what Paul refers to in Romans chapter 2.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's exactly what Romans 2 is referring to, is those innate, written on the heart of human beings. In the same way that eternity is set in our heart, according to Ecclesiastes, you think about what happens when you die. Dogs don't. They're not worried about it. They're just living in their moment. You have eternity set in your heart. You think about, why am I here? And what happens after I die? These are things that are innate to humanity. And certain rights and wrongs are just written on human hearts. I think Romans 2 is very much dealing with that. Okay, so technically speaking, I've got 2 chapters to cover. We just covered one. But the second one I didn't plan on spending a lot of time on. So just understand that that was the case right in the beginning. Okay, so in John chapter 10, verse 25, and then further on down in verse 37 and 38, Jesus would say, in regards to miracles, I told you and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, these testify of me. If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. But if I do them, though you do not believe me, believe the works, so that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I in the Father. Jesus made it very clear that the reason that he performed miracles, and in this case we're going to define miracle as something that breaks the laws of physics. Not just a good thing that happens. We often will say when a baby is born, oh, what a miracle. I hate to be a buzzkill, but not technically a miracle. Babies are born all the time. Really, really wonderful thing, but not a miracle in the sense of a sign and a wonder. Jesus said the reason that he performed miracles was so that they would testify of him. Meaning Jesus came and says, I'm the Son of God. Well, why should you believe him? If I stood up and said, I'm the Son of God, why on earth would you believe me? Send me the loony bin. The reason you believe Jesus is because he could walk on water. And then he said, I'm the Son of God. He could heal the sick, the lame, the blind. Cause the dead to rise. And then he said, I'm the Son of God. The works testified about it. Acts 2 verse 22 says a very similar idea. Men of Israel, this is Peter speaking. Listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. Miracles are a reason that often is cited for why people don't believe the Bible. Or I can't believe the Bible because it talks about miracles. My grandfather, actually, that was the tack that he took. The reason they say that is they say, well, look, miracles, those are outside the realm of science. Well, I would agree with that. Isn't that kind of the definition of a miracle, is outside the realm of science? Right, so I agree with that. But if there is a God, can he do things outside the realm of science? If there is a God, is he not the only one who can do things outside the realm of science? That make sense? All the rest of us are bound by it. The whole point of a miracle is, and this is where us understanding why miracles were performed is useful in our conversations with people. And that's why I'm covering this fairly quickly, because he spends a lot of time in the book, and I don't necessarily think we need to spend that much time on it. But we should know this. The reason God performed miracles through Jesus and the prophets and others was to testify that he was the one speaking with them. Because he's the only one who can do that. If Jesus did stuff that everybody else could do and then says, I'm the Son of God, you would say, well, why should I believe you? Because I can do that same stuff. If Jesus says, I'm the Son of God, and they say, well, why? Why should I believe you? And he says, well, I'm a carpenter. Would anybody believe he's the Son of God because he's a carpenter? We'd all say the same thing. Well, there's lots of carpenters. They're not all the Son of God. Miracles testify, and that's why they happened when they did. It's also, by the way, why we don't have them now. Because they testified to the message that was going to be preached. And should we be expecting any new messages right now? No. We have the complete Word of God. As Jude says, the faith once for all handed down to the saints. So once the Word is here, you don't need any miracles to testify to some future word. But if you did have somebody who said that they're a prophet from God today, which you do run into from time to time, what should you expect of that prophet of God? If they say, I have a message from God, what should you ask them right away? Show me a miracle. And not one of these televangelist miracles. Head on over to the hospital with me. We'll wait for the first gunshot victim, and you fix it. That's the kind of miracle I want. That's what I'm looking for. I did actually ask a guy that one time, and he said he was busy. Too busy to heal a gunshot victim. Apparently he could do it, just didn't have the time. So, but that's that second chapter that we're dealing with there. Okay. The reading for next week, chapter 9, chapter 10. Does anybody have any comments or questions or anything like that before we shut down? Okay. Chuck, do you mind leading us in prayer?